Chapter 6. The Evil-Looking Boatman. But the islanders, seeing that I was really adrift, took pity on me. I drifted very slowly to the eastward, approaching the island slantingly, and presently I saw, with hysterical relief, the launch come round and return towards me. I was heavily laden, and I could make out as she drew near Montgomery's white-haired, broad-shouldered companion sitting cramped up with the dogs and several packing cases in the stern sheets. This individual stared fixedly at me without moving or speaking. The black-faced cripple was glaring at me as fixedly in the bows near the Puma. There were 3 other men besides, 3 strange, brutish-looking fellows, at whom the staghounds were snarling savagely. Montgomery, who was steering, brought the boat by me, and rising, caught and fastened the painter to the thriller to tow me, for I was no room aboard. I had recovered from my hysterical phase by the time and answered his hail. As he approached, bravely enough, I told him the dinghy was nearly swamped, and he reached me a piggin. I was jerked back as the rope tightened the boats. For some time I was busy bowing. It was not until I had gone under water, for the water in the dinghy had been shipped, the boat was perfectly sound, and I had the leisure to look at people in the launch again. The white-haired man was found at still regarding me steadfastly, but with an expression I was now fancied of some perplexity. When my eyes met his, he looked down at the staghound that sat between his knees. He was a powerfully built man, as I have said, with a fine forehead and rather heavy features, but his eyes that had odd dropping of the skin above the lids which had often comes with advancing years, and the fall of his heavy mouth at the corners gave him an expression of pugnacious resolution. He talked to Montgomery in a tone too low for me to hear. From him my eyes traveled to his 3 men, and a strange crew they were. I only saw their faces, yet there was something in their faces, I knew not what, that gave me a queer spasm of disgust. I looked steadily at them, and the impression did not pass, though I failed to see what had occasioned it. They seemed to me to be brown men, but their limbs were oddly swathed with some thin, dirty white stuff down even the fingers and feet, and I have never seen men so wrapped up before, and women so only in the East. They wore turbans, too, and thereunder peered out their elven faces at me, faces protruding lower jaws and bright eyes. They had lank black hair, almost horsehair, and seemed as they sat to exceed the stature of many race of men I have seen. The white-haired man, who I knew at good 6 feet high, had sat a head below any one of the 3. I found afterwards that really none were taller than myself, but their bodies were abnormally long, and the thigh part and leg short, curiously twisted. At any rate, they were an amazingly ugly gang, and over the heads of them and under the forward lug peered the black face of a man whose luminous eyes were in the dark. As I stared at them, they met my gaze, and then the first one and then another turned away from the direct stare and looked at me in an odd, furtive manner. It occurred to me that I was perhaps annoying them, and turned my attention to the island we were approaching. It was low and covered with thick vegetation, chiefly a kind of palm that was new to me. From one point, a thin white thread of vapor rose slantingly to an immense height and frayed out down like a feather. We were now within the embrace of a broad bay, flanked on either hand by low promontory. The beach was of dull gray sand and sloped steeply to a ridge, perhaps 60 or 70 feet above the sea level, and irregularly set the trees and undergrowth. Halfway up was the square enclosure of some gray stone, which had been found subsequently was built partially on coral and partly a pumiceous lava. Two thatched roofs peeped from within the enclosure. A man stood awaiting the water's edge. I fancied we were still far off from some other and very grotesque-looking creatures scuttle into the bushes upon the slope, but I saw nothing of these as we drew nearer. This man was of moderate size, with a black negroid face. He had large, almost lipless mouth, extraordinary lank arms, long thin feet and bowed legs, and stood with its heavy face thrust forward staring at us. He was dressed like Montgomery and his white-haired companion, in jacket and trousers of blue serge. As we never came nearer, this individual began to run to and fro on the beach, making the most grotesque movements. At a word of command from Montgomery, the four men in the launch sprang up, and with singularly awkward gestures struck the legs. Montgomery steered us round into a narrow little dock excavated at the beach. Then the man on the beach hastened towards us. This dock, as I call it, was really a mere ditch, just long enough to phase of tide to take the longboat. I heard the bows ground in the sand, starved the dingy of the rubber off of the boat with my piggin, and the painter landed. The three muffled men with the clumsiest movements scrambled out upon the sand, and forthwith set to landing the cargo, assisted by the man on the beach. I was struck especially by curious movements of the legs of the three swathed and bandaged boatmen. Not stiff they were, but distorted in some odd way, almost as if they were jointed in the wrong place. The dogs were still snarling, and strained at their chains after these men, as the white-haired man landed with them. The three big fellows spoke to one another in odd guttural tones, and the man who had waited for us on the beach began chattering to them excitedly, a foreign language, as I fancied, as they laid hands on some bales piled near the stern. Somewhere I had heard such a voice before, and I could not think of where. The white-haired man stood, holding the tumult of 6 dogs, and bawling orders over their din. Montgomery, having unshipped the rudder, landed likewise, and all set to work at the unloading. I was too faint with my long fast and sun beating down on my bare head, to offer any assistance. Presently, a white-haired man seemed to recollect my presence, and came up to me. "You look," he said, "as though you had scarcely breakfasted." His little eyes were a brilliant black under his heavy brows. "I must apologize for that. You weren't our guest. We must make you comfortable, though you weren't uninvited, you know." He looked keenly into my face. "Montgomery says you are an educated man, Mr. Prendrick. Says you know something of science. May I ask what that signifies?" I told him I had spent some years at the Royal College of Science, and had done some researches in biology under Huxley. He had raised his eyebrows slightly at that. "That alters the case a little, Mr. Prendrick," he said, with a trifle of more respect in his manner. "As it happens, we are biologists here. This is a biological station of sort." His eye rested on the men in white who were busily hauling on the Puma, on rollers toward the walled yard. "I am Montgomery, at least," he added. "Then, when will you be able to get away? I can't say. We're off the track to anywhere. We see a ship once in a 12-month or so." He left me abruptly, and went up to the beach and past this group, and I think I entered the enclosure. The other 2 men were with Montgomery, erecting a pile of smaller packages on a low-wheeled truck. The llama was still on the launch in the rabbit hutches. The staghounds were still lashed to the thwarts. The pile of things completed, all 3 men laid hold the truck and began to shoving the ton weight or so upon it after the Puma. Presently Montgomery left them, and coming back to me held out his hand. I'm glad, he said. For my own part, that captain was fully a silly ass. He have made things lively for you. It was you, I said, that saved me again. That depends. You'll find this island an infernally rum place, I promise you. I'd watch my goings carefully, if I were you. He hesitated, and seemed to alter his mind about what was on his lips. I wish you'd help me with these rabbits, he said. His procedure with the rabbits was singular. I waded with him, and helped him lug one of the hutches ashore. No sooner was that done than he opened the door of it, and tilting on the thing on one end and turned its living contents on the ground. They fell a still struggling heap on top of one another. He clapped his hands, and forthwith went off with some hopping of theirs. 15 or 20 of them, I think, up the beach. Increase and multiply, my friend, said Montgomery. Replenish the island. Hit Harrow, we have a certain lack of meat here. I watched them disappearing. The white-haired man returned to a brandy flask of some biscuits. Something to go on with, Prendrick, he said, in a far more familiar tone than before. I made no ado, but set work on the biscuits at once, while the white-haired man helped Montgomery to release about some score more of rabbits. 3 big hutches, however, went up on the house with the puma. The brandy did not touch, for I have been an abstainer from my birth. Chapter 7. The Locked Door. The reader will perhaps understand that at first everything was so strange about me, and my position was the outcome of such an unexpected adventure, that I had no discernment of relative strangeness of this thing or that thing. I followed the llama up on the beach, and was overtaken by Montgomery, who asked me not to enter the stone enclosure. I noticed then that the puma cage and the pile of packages had been placed outside the entrance of his quadrangle. I turned and saw the launch had now been unloaded, run out again, and was being beached. The white-haired man was walking towards us. He addressed Montgomery. And now comes the problem of this uninvited guest. What are we to do with him? He knows something of science, said Montgomery. I'm itching to get to work again with this new stuff, said the white-haired man, nodding towards the enclosure. His eyes grew brighter. I dare say you are, said Montgomery, anything but a cordial tone. We can't send him over there, and we can't spare the time to build him a new shanty. We certainly can't take him into our confidence just yet. I'm in your hands, I said. I had no idea of what he meant by over there. I've been thinking of some things, Montgomery answered. There's my room and the outer door. That's it, said the elder man promptly, looking at Montgomery, and all 3 of us went towards the enclosure. I'm sorry to make a mystery, Mr. Prendrick, but you'll remember that you're uninvited. Our little establishment here contains a secret or so. It is a kind of Bluebeard's chamber. In fact, nothing very dreadful, really, to a sane man, but just now, as we don't know you. Decidedly, I said, I should be a fool to take offense at any want of confidence. He twisted his heavy mouth into a faint smile. He was on one of those saturnine people who smile with the corners of their mouth down. I bowed his acknowledgment and my complacence. The main entrance and the enclosure was passed. It was a heavy wooden gate, framed in iron and locked, with the cargo of the launch piled outside it. And at the corner we came to a small doorway not previously observed. The white-haired man produced a little bundle of keys from the pocket and greasy blue jacket, opened this door, and entered. His keys, and the elaborate locking up of the place while it was still under his eye, struck me as peculiar. I followed him, and found myself in a small apartment, plainly but not uncomfortably furnished, with its inner door, which was slightly ajar, opening into a paved courtyard. The inner door Montgomery at once closed. A hammock was slung across the darker corner of the room, and a small unglazed window defended by an iron bar looked out towards the sea. This white-haired man told me to be at my apartment, and in the inner door, which, for fear of accidents, he said, he would have locked on the other side. It was my limit inward. He called my attention to a convenient deck chair before the window, and an array of old books. Chiefly, I found, surgical works and editions of the Latin and Greek classics, languages I cannot read with any comfort, on a shelf near the hammock. He left the room by the outer door, as if afraid of avoid opening the inner one again. "We usually have our meals here," said Montgomery, and then, as if in doubt, went after the other. "Moreau," I heard him call, and for a moment I do not think I noticed. Then I handled the bookshelf, came up to consciousness, where I had heard the name of Moreau before. I sat down before the window, took some biscuits and still remained to me, and ate them with an excellent appetite. Moreau! Though at the window I saw one of those unaccountable men in white lugging a packing case along the beach. Presently the window frame hid him. Then I heard a key inserted and turned the lock behind me. After a little while I heard through the locked door the noise of the staghounds, and that had now been brought up from the beach. They were not barking, but sniffing and growling in a furious fashion. I could hear the rather rapid patter of their feet, and Montgomery's voice soothing them. I was very much impressed by the elaborate secrecy of these two men regarding the contents of this place, and for some time I was thinking of that most unaccountable familiarity of the name Moreau, but so odd is the human memory that I could not recall that well-known name in its proper connection. From that my thoughts went to indefinable queerness to a deformed man on the beach. I never saw such a gait, such odd motions as he pulled out of the box. I recalled that none of these men had spoken to me, though most of them had found looking at me at one time or another in a peculiarly furtive manner, quite unlike the frank stare of an unsophisticated savage. Indeed, they had all seemed remarkably taciturn when they did speak, endowed with very uncanny voices. What was wrong with them? Then I recalled my eyes of Montgomery's ungainly attendant. Just as I was thinking of him, he came in. He was now dressed in white, and carried a little tray with some coffee and boiled vegetables thereon. I could hardly repress a shuddering recoil as he came, bending amiably, and placed the tray before me on the table. Then astonishment paralyzed me. Under his stingy black locks I saw his ear. It jumped upon me and suddenly close to my face. The man had pointed ears covered with fine brown fur. "Your breakfast, sir," he said. I started at his face without attempting to answer him. He turned and went towards the door, regarding me oddly over his shoulder. I followed him out with my eyes, and as I did so, by some odd trick of unconsciousness celebration, there came surging into my head of the phrase, "the Moreau Hollows." Was it? The Moreau? Ah! It sent my memory back 10 years. The Moreau horrors. The phrase drifted loose in my mind for a moment, and then I saw it in red lettering in a little buff-colored pamphlet to read, which made one shiver and creep. Then I remembered distinctly all about it. The had forgotten pamphlet came back in startling vividness to my mind. I had been there a mere lad then, and Moreau was, I suppose, about 50, a prominent and masterful physiologist, well known in scientific circles and for his extraordinary imagination and brutal directness in discussion. Was this the same Moreau? He had published some very astonishing facts in connection with the transfusion of blood, and in addition was known to be doing some valuable work on morbid growths. And then suddenly his career was closed. He had to leave England. A journalist obtained access to his laboratory in capacity of the laboratory's assistant, with deliberate intention of making sensational exposures, and by the help of a shocking accident, if it was an accident, his gruesome pamphlet became notorious. On the day of his publication, a wretched dog, flayed and otherwise mutilated, escaped from Moreau's house. It was in the silly season, and a prominent editor, a cousin of the temporary laboratory assistant, appealed to the conscience of the nation. It was not the first time that conscience was turned against the methods of research. The doctor was simply howled out of the country. It may be that he deserved to be, but I still think that the tepid support of his fellow investigators and his desertion by the great body of scientific workers was a shameful thing. Yet some of his experiments, by the journalist's account, were wantonly cruel. He might have perhaps have purchased his social peace by abandoning his investigations, but he apparently preferred the latter, as most men would have who have once fallen under the overmastering spell of research. He was unmarried, and indeed nothing but his own interest to consider. I felt convinced that this must be the same man. Everything pointed to it. It dawned upon me to what end the puma and the other animals, which had now brought the other luggage to the enclosure behind the house, were destined. In a curious faint odor, the hiatus of something familiar, an odor that had been in the background of my consciousness, hit Harrow, suddenly came forward into the forefront of my thoughts. It was the antiseptic odor of the dissecting room. I heard the puma growling through the wall, and one of the dogs yelped as though it had been struck. Yet surely, and especially to another scientific man, there was nothing so horrible in vivisection as to account for this secrecy, and some odd leap in my thoughts were pointed at the luminous eyes of Montgomery's attendant came back again before me at the sharpest definition. I stared before me out at the green sea, frothing under the freshening breeze, and let these other strange memories in the last few days chase one another through my mind. What could it all mean? Locked enclosure on a lonely island, a notorious vivisector, and these crippled and distorted men. Chapter 8. The Crying of the Puma. Montgomery interrupted my tangle of mystification and suspicion about 1 o'clock, and his grotesque attendant followed him with every tray bearing bread, some herds of and other staples, a flask of whiskey, a jug of water, and 3 glasses and knives. I glanced askance at this strange creature and found him watching me with his queer, restless eyes. Montgomery said he would lunch with me, but that Moreau was too preoccupied with some work time to come. Moreau, I said. I know that name. The devil you do, he said. What an ass I was to mention it to you. I might have thought. Anyhow, it will give you an inkling of our mysteries. Whiskey? No thanks, I'm an abstainer. I wish I'd been. It's no use in locking the door after the steed is stolen. It is that infernal stuff which led to my coming here. That and a froggy night. I thought myself in a luck at time when Moreau offered to get me off. It's queer. Montgomery, I said, suddenly as the outer door closed. Why has your man pointed ears? Damn, he said over his first mouthful of food. He stared at me for a moment and then repeated, pointed ears? Little points to them, I said, as calmly as possible with a catch of my breath. A fine black fur at the edge is the... He helped himself to whiskey with water in great deliberation. I was under the impression that his hair has covered his ears. I saw them as he stooped by me to put coffee as you sat on the table, and his eyes shine in the dark. By this time, Montgomery had recovered from the surprise of my question. I always thought, he said deliberately, with a certain accusation of his flavoring lisp, that there were something the manner of his ears. From that way he covered them. What were they like? I persuaded from his manner of ignorance was presence, though still I could hardly tell the man that I thought him a liar. Pointed, I said, rather small and furry, distinctly furry. But the whole man is one of the strangest beings I ever set eyes on. A sharp, hoarse cry of animal pain came from the enclosure behind us. Its depth and volume testified to the puma. I saw Montgomery wince. Yes, he said. Where did you pick up the creature? San Francisco. He's an ugly brute, I admit. Half-witted, you know. I can't remember where he came from, but I'm used to him. You know, we both are. How does he strike you? He's unnatural, I said. There is something about him. Don't think me fanciful, but it gives me a little nasty sensation, a tightening of my muscles when it comes near me. It's a touch of diabolical fact. Montgomery had stopped eating while I told him this. Rum, he said. I can't see it. He resumed his meal. I had no idea of it, he said, and masticated. The crew of the schooner must have felt the same. Made a dead set of the poor devil. You saw the captain? Suddenly, the puma howled again, this time more painfully. Montgomery swore under his breath. I had half a mind to attack him about the men on the beach. Then the poor brute within gave a vent of series of short, sharp cries. Your men on the beach, I said. What race are they? Excellent fellows, aren't they? He said, absent-mindedly, knitting his brows as the animal yelled out sharply. I said no more. There was another outcry worse than the former. He looked at me with his dull gray eyes, and then took some more whiskey. He tried to draw me into a discussion about alcohol, professing to have saved my life with it. He seemed anxious to lay stress on the fact that I owed him my life. And I answered him distractedly. Presently, our meal came to an end. The misshapen monster with pointed ears cleared the remains away, and Montgomery left me alone in my room all again. All the time had been in a state of ill-concealed irritation at the noise of the vivisected puma. He had spoken of this odd want of nerve, and left me to his obvious application. I found myself that the cries were singularly irritating, and they grew depth and intensity as the afternoon wore on. They were painful at first, but their constant resurgence at last altogether upset my balance. I flung aside a crib of horse and then I had been reading, and began to clench my fists and bite my lips, to pace the room. Presently I got stopping my ears with my fingers. The emotional appeal of those yells grew upon me steadily, grew at last to such an exquisite expression of suffering that I could stand it in that confined room no longer. I stepped out of the door in the slumberous heat of the late afternoon, walking past the main entrance, locked again. I noticed and turned the corner of the wall. The crying sounded even louder out of the doors. It was as if all the pain in the world had been found a voice. Yet I had known such pain was in the next room. It had been dumb, I believe. I thought since I could have stood it well. It was when suffering finds a voice and sets our nerves quivering that this pity comes troubling us. But in spite of the brilliant sunlight and green fans of the trees waving over the soothing sea breeze, the world was a confusion, blurred and drifting back and the red phantasms, until I was out of earshot of the house and cressured wall. Chapter 9. The Thing in the Forest. I strode through the undergrowth that clothed the ridge behind the house, scarcely heeding whither I went, passed on through the shadow of a thick cluster of straight-stemmed trees beyond it, and so presently found myself some way on the other side of the ridge, and descending towards the streamlet that ran through a narrow valley. I paused and listened. The distance I had come, on the intervening masses of thicket, deadened any sound that might be coming from the enclosure. The air was still. Then a rabbit emerged and went scampering up the slope before me. I hesitated and sat down on the edge of the shade. The place was a pleasant one. The rivulet was hidden in the luxuriant vegetation of the banks save at one point, where I caught a triangular patch of glittering water. On the further side, I saw through the bluish haze tangle of trees and creepers. Above these again the luminous blue sky. Here and there a splash of white or crimson marked the blooming of some trailing epiphyte. I let my eyes wander over this scene for a while, and then I began to turn over in my mind again this strange peculiarities of Montgomery's man, but it was too hot to think elaborately, and I presently fell into a tranquil state of midway between dozing and waking. From this I was aroused, after I not know how long, by a rustling amidst the greenery on the other side of the stream. For a moment I could see nothing but the waving summits of ferns and reeds. Then, suddenly, upon the bank of the stream appeared something. At first I could not distinguish what it was. It bowed its round head to the water and began to drink. Then I saw it was a man, going on all fours like a beast. He was clothed in bluish cloth, and was of a copper-colored hue, with black hair. It seemed as that grotesque ugliness was an invariable character of these islanders. I could hear the such of the water of his lips as he drank. I leant forward to see him better, and a piece of lava, detached by my hand, went pattering down the slope. He looked up guilty, and his eyes met mine. Forthwith we scrambled to his feet, and stood wiping the clumsy hand across his mouth regarding me. His legs were scarcely half the length of his body. So, staring one another out of countenance, we remained for perhaps a space of a minute. Then, stopping to look back once or twice, he slunk off among the bushes to the right of me. I heard the swish of the fawns grow faint in the distance, die away. Long after he had disappeared, I remained sitting up, staring at the direction of his retreat. My drowsy tranquillity had gone. I was startled by a noise behind me, and turning suddenly by the flapping tail of a rabbit vanishing up the slope, I had jumped to my feet. The apparition of this grotesque, half-bestial creature, and suddenly populated by the stillness of the afternoon for me. I looked around me rather nervously, and regretted that I was unharmed. Then, I thought that the man had just seen that had been clothed in bluish cloth, had not been naked as a savage would have been. I tried to persuade myself from the fact that he was, after all, probably a peaceful character, and the dull ferocity of his countenance belied him. Yet I was greatly disturbed by the apparition. I walked to the left along the slope, turning my head about and peering this way among the straight seams of the trees. Why should a man go on all fours and drink with his lips? So presently I heard an animal wailing again, and taking it to the puma, I turned about and walked in a direction diametrically opposite to the sound. This led me down a stream, across which I stepped and pushed my way up through the undergrowth beyond. I was startled by a great patch of vivid scarlet on the ground, and was going up to it and found it to be a rather peculiar fungus, branched and corrugated like a foliaceous lichen, but disquailingly into slime at touch. And then the shadows of some luxuriant ferns, I came up to an unpleasant thing. The dead body of rabbit covered the shining flies, but still warm and the head torn off. I stopped aghast at the sight of the scattered blood. Here at last one visitor of the island disposed of. There were no more traces other violence about it. I looked at as though it had suddenly been snatched up and killed, and as I stared at the little furry body came the difficulty of how the thing had been done. The vague dread that had been in my mind since the inhuman face of the man at the stream grew distincter as I stood there. I began to realize the hardihood of my expedition among those unknown people. The thicket about me became altered in my imagination. Every shadow became something more than a shadow, became an ambush. Every rustle became a threat. Invisible things seemed to watch me. I resolved to go back into the enclosure on the beach, suddenly turned away to thrust myself violently, possibly even frantically, through the bushes, anxious and clear space about me again. I stopped just in time to prevent myself emerging from an open space. It was kind of a glade in the forest, made by a fall, lings were already starting to struggle for a vacant space, and beyond, the dense growth and stems and twining vines, splashes of fungus and flowers closed again. Before me, squatting together, the fungoid ruins of a huge fallen tree were, and still unaware of my approach, were these three grotesque human figures. One was evidently a female, and the other two were men. They were naked, save for swathings of scarlet cloth about the middle, and their skins were of a dull pinkish drab color, such as I had seen no savages before. They had fat, heavy, chinless faces, retreating foreheads, and scant, bristly hair upon their heads. I had never seen such bestial-looking creatures. They were talking, or at least one of the men was talking to the other two, and all three had been too closely interested in to heed the rustling of my approach. They swayed their heads and shoulders from side to side. The speaker's words came thick and sloppy, and though I could hear them distinctly, could not distinguish what he had said. He seemed to me to be reciting some complicated gibberish. Presently, this articulation became shriller, and spreading his hands, he rose to his feet, and that the others began to gibber in unison, also rising to their feet, spreading their hands and swaying their bodies in a rhythm with their chant. I noticed the abnormal shortness of their legs, their lank, clumsy feet. All three began slowly to circle around, raising and stamping their feet and waving their arms. A kind of tune crept into their rhythmic recreation, and a refrain, Alula, or Balula, it sounded like. Their eyes began to sparkle, and their ugly faces brightened with an expression of strange pleasure. Saliva dripped from their lipless mouths. Suddenly, I watched their grotesque, unaccountable gestures. I perceived clearly that the first time what was that had offended me had given me two inconsistent, conflicting impressions of utter strangeness, and yet the strangest familiarity. Three creatures engaged in this mysterious rite with human shape, and yet human beings with strangest air about them as some unfamiliar animal. With each of these creatures, despite its human form, its ragged clothing, its rough humanity and bodily form, I had woven into its movements, into the expression of its countenance, into its whole presence, some now irresistible suggestion of a hog, a swinish taint, an unmistakable mark of a beast. I stood overcome by this amazing realization, and then the most horrible questionings came rushing to my mind. They began leaping into the air, first one, then the other, whooping and grunting. Then one slipped, and for a moment was on all fours. To recover, indeed, forthwith, but that transitory stream of true animalism of these monsters was enough. I turned as noiselessly as possible, and becoming every now and rigid with the fear of being discovered, as a branch cracked or leaf rustled, I pushed back into the bushes. It was long before I grew bolder and dared to move freely. Only my idea of the moment was to get away from these foul beings, and I scarcely noticed that I had emerged upon a faint pathway amidst the trees. Then, suddenly traversing a little glade, I saw, with an unpleasant start, two clumsy legs among the trees, walking with noiseless footsteps parallel with my course, and perhaps 30 yards away from me, and head and upper part of the body were hidden by a tangle of creeper. I stopped abruptly, hoping the creature did not see me. The feet stomped as I did. So nervous was that I controlled an impulse to headlong flight with utmost difficulty. Then, looking hard, I distinguished through the interlacing network the head and body of the brute I had seen drinking. He moved his head. There was an emerald flash in his eyes as he glanced at me from the shadow of the trees, a half-luminous color that vanished as he turned his head again. He was motionless for a moment, and then with a noiseless tread began running through the green confusion. In another moment he had vanished behind some bushes. I could not see him, but I felt that he had stomped and was watching me again. What on earth was he, man or beast? What did he want with me? I had no weapon, not even a stick. Flight would be At any rate, the thing, whatever it was, lacked the courage to attack me. Setting my teeth hard, I walked straight towards him, and I was anxious not to show the fear that seemed chilling my backbone. I pushed through the tangle of tall white flowered bushes, and I saw him 20 paces beyond, looking over his shoulder at me and hesitating. I advanced a step or two, looking steadfastly into his eyes. "Who are you?" I said. He tried to meet my gaze. "No," he said suddenly, and turning and went bounding away from me through the undergrowth. Then he turned and stared at me again. His eyes shone brightly out of the dusk under the trees. My heart was in my mouth, but I felt only my chance was a bluff. I walked steadily towards him. He turned again and vanished into the dusk. Once more, I thought I caught a glance of eyes, and that was all. For the first time, I realized how lateness of the hour might affect me. The sun had set some minutes ago, and the swift dusk of the tropics was already fading out of the eastern sky, and a pioneer moth fluttered silently by my head. Unless I would spend the night among the unknown dangers of the mysterious forest, I must hasten back to the enclosure. I thought the return to that pain haunted the refuge and was extremely disagreeable, but still more the idea was being overtaken in the open darkness and all that darkness might conceal. I gave one more into the blue shadows that had swallowed up this odd creature, and then it retraced my way down the slope toward the stream, going as I judged the direction from which I had come. I walked eagerly, my mind confused by many things, and presently found myself in the level place among scattered trees. The colorless clearness that comes after the sunset flush was darkling. The blue sky grew above momentarily deeper, and the little stars one by one pierced and attenuated the light. The interspaces of the trees, the gaps and furthered vegetation that had hazy blue that daylight grew back and mysterious. I pushed on. The color vanished from the world. The treetops rose against the luminous blue sky in an inky silhouette, and all below that outline melted into the formless blackness. Presently the trees grew thinner, and the shrubby undergrowth more abundant. Then there was a desolate space covered in white sand, and then another expanse of tangled bushes. I did not remember crossing the sand opening before. I began to be tormented by a faint rustling upon my right hand. I thought it was at first I fancy, for whenever I stopped there silence, save evening breeze in the treetops. Then I was turned to hurry on again. There was an echo to my footsteps. I turned away from the thickets, keeping to the more open ground, and endeavoring by sudden turns now and then to surprise something in the act creeping upon me. I saw nothing, and nevertheless my sense of another presence grew steadily. I increased my pace, and after some time came into a slight ridge, crossed it, and turned sharply, regarding it steadfastly from the further side. It came out black and clear against the darkling sky, and presently a shapeless lump heaved up momentarily against the skyline and vanished again. I felt assured now my tawny-faced antagonist was stalking me once more, and coupled with that another unpleasant realization that I had lost my way. For a time I hurried on hopelessly perplexed, and pursued by stealthy approach. Whatever it was, the thing either lacked the courage to attack me, or was waiting to take me at some disadvantage. I kept studiously to the open. At times I would turn and listen, and presently I had half persuaded myself that the pursuer had abandoned the cause, or a mere creation of my disordered imagination. I had heard the sound of the sea, and quickened my footsteps almost into a run, and immediately there was a stumble in my rear. I had turned suddenly, and stared at uncertain trees behind me, and black shadows seemed to leap into another. I listened rigid and heard nothing but the creep of blood into my ears. I had thought my nerves were unstrung, and that my imagination was tricking me. I had turned resolutely towards the sound of the sea again. In a minute or so the trees grew thinner, and emerged upon bare and low headland running into the sober water. The night was calm and clear, and the reflection of growing multitude and stars shivered in the tranquil heaving of the sea. Some way out, the wash was upon an irregular band of reefs shone with a pallid light of its own. Westward I saw the zodiacal light mingling with the yellow brilliance of the evening star. The coast fell away from me to the east, westward, and hidden by the shoulder to the cape. Then I recalled the fact that Moreau's beach lay to the west. A twig snapped behind me. There was a rustle. I turned and stood facing to the dark trees. I could see nothing, or else see too much. Every dark form in the dimness and ominous quality, its peculiar suggestion of alert watchfulness. I stood for perhaps a minute, and then, with an eye to the trees still, turned westward to the headland, and as I moved, one among the lurking shadows moved to follow me. My heart beat quickly. Presently, the broad sweep of a bay to the westward became visible. I halted again. The noiseless shadow halted a dozen yards from me. The little point of light shone on the further bent of a curve, and the gray sweep of the sandy beach lay faint under the starlight. Perhaps 2 miles away was that point of light. To get to the beach, I have to go to the trees, and shadows lurked down a bushy slope. I could see the thing more distinctly now. It was no animal, for it stood erect. That I opened my mouth to speak, and found a hoarse phlegm choked my voice. I tried again, and shouted, "Who is there?" There was no answer. I advanced a step. The thing did not move, and I only gathered itself together. My foot struck a stone. That gave me an idea. Without taking my eyes off the black form before me, I stooped and picked up this lump of rock. But my motion, the thing turned abruptly as a dog might have, and slunk obliquely into the further darkness. Then I recalled a schoolboy expedient against big dogs, and twisted the rock into my handkerchief, and gave me this turn around my wrist. I heard a movement further off among the shadows, as if the thing were in retreat. Then suddenly my tense excitement gave way. I broke into a profuse perspiration and fell a trembling with my adversity routed this weapon in my hand. At some time before I could summon the resolution to go down to the trees and bushes upon the flank of the headland to the beach, at last I did it at a run, and as I emerged from the thicket upon the sand, I heard some other body crashing after me. At that I completely lost my head for fear, and I began running along the sand. Forthwith there came the swift patter of soft feet in pursuit. I gave a wild cry, and redoubled my pace. Some dim black things about 3 or 4 times the size of rabbits went running or hopping up from the beach towards the bushes as I passed. So long as I live, I shall remember the terror of that chase. I ran near the water's edge, and heard every now and then the splash of my feet, and gained upon me. Far away, hopelessly far, was the yellow light. All the night was about us, black and still. Splash, splash, came from the pursuing feet. Nearer and nearer. I felt my breath going, for I was quite out of training. It whooped as I drew it. I felt like a pain like a knife in my side. I perceived the thing would come up with me long before I reached the enclosure, and, desperate and sobbing for my breath, I wheeled around upon it and struck it as it came up to me. Struck it with all my might. The stone came out in sling of the handkerchief as I did so. As I turned, the thing, which had been running on all fours, rose to its feet, and the missile fell fair on its left temple. The skull rang loud. The animal man blundered into me, thrust me back with its hands, and went staggering past, and to fall headlong upon the sand with its face in the water. There it lay still. I could not bring myself to approach the back heap. I left it there, with the water rippling round it, until under the still stars, and giving it a wide berth, pursued my way towards the yellow glow of the house. And presently, with a positive effect of relief, it came the pitiful moaning of the puma, and the sound that originally driven me out to explore this mysterious island. At that, though I was faint and horribly fatigued, I gathered together all my strength and began running again toward the light. I thought I heard a voice calling me. Chapter 10. The Crying of the Man. As I drew near the house, I saw the light shone from the door of my room, and then I heard coming from out the darkness of the side of that orge of long light the voice of Montgomery shouting, "Prendrick!" I continued running. Presently I heard him again. I replied by a feeble "Hello!" and in another moment I had staggered to him. "Where have you been?" he said, holding me at arm's length so that the light of the door fell on my face. "We have both been so busy we forgot you until about half hour ago." He led me into the room and sat me down into the deck chair. For a while I was blinded by the light. "We did not think you would start to explore this island of ours without telling us," he said, and then, "I was afraid, but what? Hello!" My last remaining strength slipped from me, and head fell forward into my chest. I think he found a certain satisfaction in giving me brandy. "For God's sake," I said, "fasten that door. You have been meeting some of our curiosities, eh?" he said. He locked the door and turned to me again. He asked me no questions, but gave me more brandy water and pressed me to eat. I was in a state of collapse. He said something vague about his forgetting warned me. And asked me briefly when I left the house and what I had seen. I answered him briefly in fragmentary sentences. "Tell me what it all means," I said, in a state bordering on hysterics. "It's nothing so very dreadful," he said, "but I think you have had about enough for the day." The puma suddenly gave a sharp yell of pain, and that he swore under his breath. "I'm damned," he said, "if this place is not as bad as that Gower Street with its cats." "Montgomery," I said, "what was that thing that came after me? Was it a beast or a man?" "If you don't sleep tonight," he said, "you'll be off your head tomorrow." I stood up in front of him. "What was that thing that came after me?" I asked. He looked at me squarely in the eyes and twisted his mouth askew. His eyes, which had seemed animated a minute before, went dull. "From your account," he said, "I'm thinking it was a boggle." I felt a gust of intense irritation, which passed as quickly as it came. I flung myself into the chair as I pressed my hands against my forehead. The puma began once more. Montgomery came around behind me and put his hand over my shoulder. "Look here, Prendrick," he said. "I had no business to let you out and drift out to this silly island of ours, but it's not so bad as you feel, man. Your nerves are worked to the rags. Let me give you something that will make you sleep. That will keep you on for hours yet. You must simply get to sleep, or I won't answer for it." I did not reply. I bowed forward, covered my face with my hands. Presently he returned with a small measure containing a dark liquid. This he gave me. I took it unresistingly, and helped me into the hammock. When I awoke, it was a broad day. For a little while I lay flat, staring up at the roof above me. The rafters, I observed, were made out of the timbers of the ship. I then turned my head and saw a meal prepared for me on the table. I perceived that I was hungry and prepared for a clamber of the hammock, which was very politely anticipating my intention, twisted round and deposited me upon all fours on the floor. I got up and sat down before the food, and I had a heavy feeling in my head, and only the vaguest memory at first of the things that had happened overnight. The morning breeze blew very pleasantly through the unglazed window, and the food contributed to the sense of the animal confront which I had experienced. Presently, the door behind me, the door inward towards the yard of the enclosure, opened. I turned and saw Montgomery's face. "All right," he said. "I'm frightfully busy," and he shut the door. Afterwards, I discovered that he forgot to relock it. Then I recalled the expression of his face the previous night, and in full memory I had experienced reconstructed it itself before me. Even as that fear came back to me, a cry from within, but this time it was not a cry of a puma. But I put down the mouthful that hesitated upon my lips, and listened. Silence. Save for a whisper of the morning breeze, I began to think of my ears had deceived me. After a long pause, I resumed my meal, but with my ears still vigilant. Presently, I heard something else, very faint and low. I sat unfrozen in my attitude. Though it was faint and low, it moved me more profoundly than all that I had heard the abominations behind the wall. There was no mistake this time that the quality of the dim, broken sounds, no doubt of their source, for it was groaning, broken by the sobs and gasps of anguish. It was no brute this time. It was a human being in torment. As I realized this, I rose. In 3 steps, I crossed the room and seized the handle of the door into the yard. It flung open before me. "Prendrick, man, stop!" cried Montgomery, intervening. I startled. Deerhound yelped and snarled. There was blood, I saw, in the sink, brown, sub-scarlet. I smelt a peculiar smell of carbolic acid. Then, through an open doorway beyond, a dim light of a shadow, I saw something bound painfully upon framework, scarred, red, bandaged. Then, blotting this out, appeared the face of old Moreau, white and terrible. In a moment, he gripped me by his shoulder with a hand smeared red, and twisted me off my feet, and flung me headlong back into my own room. He lifted me as though I was a little child. I fell at full length upon the floor, and the door slammed shut out in the passionate intensity of his face. Then I heard the key turn in the lock, and Montgomery's voice in expulsion. "Ruin the work of a lifetime," I heard Moreau say. "He does not understand," said Montgomery, and the other things were inaudible. "I can't spare you the time yet," said Moreau. The rest I did not hear. I picked myself up and stood trembling, my mind a chaos of most horrible misgivings. It could be possible, I thought, that such a thing of the vivisection of men carried here, a question like lightning across the tumultuous sky, and suddenly a clouded horror of my mind condensed a vivid realization of my own danger.